My dog started barking at the basement door at midnight. When I got there, I saw fresh footprints on the stairs going up. Maxie's bark wasn't her usual alert at a squirrel or passing car. This was the sound she made when something was fundamentally wrong, a low, sustained growl that escalated into sharp barks that echoed through our house. I sat up in bed, heart already pounding before my brain fully processed what woke me. The digital clock read 12:03 a.m., and Maxie was at my bedroom door, hackles raised, staring down the hallway toward the basement entrance. I grabbed my phone and the baseball bat I kept under the bed since the break-ins started happening in our neighborhood 3 months ago. Maxie wouldn't move from the doorway, just kept barking at something I couldn't see yet, her entire body rigid with tension that made my skin crawl. I moved down the hallway with the bat raised, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The basement door stood open exactly 6 inches, which was impossible because I'd locked it before bed like I did every night since I'd started hearing sounds down there. Sounds I'd convinced myself were just the old house settling or pipes expanding. But the door was open now and Maxie was backing away from it, still barking, still warning me about something my human senses hadn't detected yet. I reached for the light switch and flooded the stairwell with harsh fluorescent brightness that made me squint. That's when I saw them. Fresh, wet footprints on the wooden stairs, leading upward from the basement, each print perfectly formed and glistening under the light. The prints were large, maybe size 12 or 13, and they were still wet enough to reflect the overhead bulb. Someone had come up these stairs within the last few minutes. But my hands started shaking so hard I nearly dropped the bat. The footprints stopped at the landing where I was standing, but there was no one visible in the hallway. I spun around, checking every shadow and corner, but my house was empty except for me and Maxie. The dog had gone silent now, which was somehow worse than the barking. She was staring at my bedroom with her ears pinned back, a low whine building in her throat. I followed her gaze and saw my bedroom door slowly closing, moving with deliberate slowness like someone was carefully pulling it shut from inside. I'd left that door wide open when I came out. Someone was in my bedroom. Someone who'd come up from the basement and walked past me while I was sleeping. I ran to the front door and fumbled with the deadbolt, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Maxie was right behind me, pressing against my legs, and I could feel her trembling. I got the door open and we both stumbled onto the front porch, and I was reaching for my phone to call 911 when I realized I'd left it on my nightstand, inside the house, in the bedroom where someone was hiding. The street was empty at this hour, just rows of dark houses and streetlights casting orange pools on the asphalt. My nearest neighbor was Mrs. Kowalski 3 houses down, and she was 86 and deaf in one ear. I started running toward her house anyway, Maxie keeping pace beside me, when I heard my front door slam shut behind me. The sound echoed down the quiet street like a gunshot. I pounded on Mrs. Kowalski's door hard enough to hurt my fist, shouting her name and begging her to call the police. Lights came on inside, and I heard shuffling footsteps. She opened the door with the chain still attached, peering out at me through the gap with suspicious eyes. When she recognized me, she unhooked the chain and pulled me inside, demanding to know what was wrong. I told her someone was in my house, and she immediately grabbed her phone and dialed 911, speaking in rapid Polish-accented English while I stood in her foyer shaking and trying to catch my breath. Maxie pressed against my legs, and I realized the dog was staring back toward my house through Mrs. Kowalski's front window. Every muscle in her body was tense again. The police arrived within 8 minutes, 2 cruisers with lights flashing that woke up half the street. Officer Denise Wu took my statement on Mrs. Kowalski's porch, while her partner, Officer Graves, entered my house with his weapon drawn. I described the footprints and the closing bedroom door and the wet prints that had no source. Wu wrote everything down with a neutral expression that made me wonder if she believed me. Graves emerged from my house 15 minutes later and reported finding no one inside. No signs of forced entry, no intruder. Just an empty house with all the doors and windows locked from the inside. Wu asked if I'd been drinking or taking any medications. Her tone was professional, but the implication was clear. I insisted they check the basement, and Wu agreed to walk through it with me. We went down those stairs together, her flashlight sweeping across concrete walls and exposed pipes. My basement was unfinished. Just a large open space with my water heater and furnace and boxes of storage I'd been meaning to sort through for years. Wu's light caught something on the far wall, and she moved toward it. Someone had drawn on the concrete with what looked like chalk or white paint. 3 words in letters 2 feet tall, already inside. The letters were fresh, the edges sharp and clean. Wu radioed for backup immediately, her professional calm finally cracking into something that looked like concern. They searched my house again, this time with 4 officers and a K9 unit. The dog alerted in my bedroom closet, barking at the back wall where my winter coats hung. Graves moved the coats aside and found a section of drywall that had been cut and removed, revealing a crawl space behind my bedroom that I didn't know existed. The opening was barely 3 feet tall and maybe 2 feet wide, just large enough for someone to squeeze through. Wu shined her light into the darkness, and we all saw the blanket and empty food wrappers and a bucket that I didn't want to think about. Someone had been living in my walls. For how long, none of us knew. The crawl space connected to the basement through a gap in the foundation that had been hidden behind old shelving units. Wu took photos of everything while Graves called for a detective. They found more evidence of habitation. a sleeping bag, and a collection of my personal items that had gone missing over the past few months. My spare house key that I'd thought I'd lost, photographs of me taken through my windows, a journal filled with detailed notes about my daily routine, what time I left for work, what time I came home, what I ate for dinner. The handwriting was precise and methodical, and reading those entries made my skin feel like it was trying to crawl off my body. Detective Rains arrived at 2:30 a.m., a woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. She reviewed the evidence and asked me questions about when I'd started noticing strange things in my house. I told her about objects moving, doors I'd sworn I'd locked standing open, the feeling of being watched that I'd dismissed as paranoia. She asked if I lived alone, and I said yes. It had been just me and Maxie since my divorce finalized 8 months ago. Rains wrote something in her notebook that made her frown. She asked for my ex-husband's name, and I told her David Brenner, but David lived in Seattle now with his new girlfriend. Rains said she'd need to verify that. They collected fingerprints from the crawl space and the basement, and a forensic tech found something that made everyone in the basement go quiet. There were 2 different sets of prints. 2 people had been living in my walls, not one. Rains asked me to sit down and told me this changed everything. If 2 people were coordinating to stalk me from inside my own house, this wasn't a random squatter situation. This was planned and deliberate and potentially much more dangerous than she'd initially assessed. She asked if I had anywhere else to stay tonight, and I thought of my sister Vanessa, who lived 40 minutes away. Rains said that would be good, and she'd have a patrol car follow me there to make sure I wasn't being tailed. I packed a bag while officers stood in my bedroom doorway, and I couldn't stop staring at that hole in my closet wall. How many nights had someone been back there while I slept? How many times had they watched me through that gap in the drywall? I found myself checking all my clothes to see if anything had been touched or moved, and that's when I discovered my underwear drawer had been gone through. Several pairs were missing, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Wu saw my face and asked what was wrong, and when I told her, she added it to the report with an expression that suggested this detail confirmed something she'd been suspecting. Maxie wouldn't let me out of her sight while I packed, following me from room to room and whining whenever I moved too far away. The dog had known something was wrong long before I did, had been trying to warn me for months probably, but I'd dismissed her behavior as anxiety from the divorce. I felt guilty and grateful and terrified all at once. Rains told me the forensic team would need to process my house for at least 2 days, maybe longer, and I should plan on staying with Vanessa for a while. She gave me her card and told me to call immediately if I remembered anything else, or if anyone contacted me in a strange way. The emphasis on anyone made my stomach drop. The patrol car followed me to Vanessa's apartment, and I kept checking my rearview mirror for other vehicles that might be tailing us. Every set of headlights looked suspicious. Every car that took the same turn felt like a threat. Vanessa was waiting up when I arrived, having gotten my panicked call an hour earlier. She hugged me tight enough to hurt, and I finally let myself cry, the shock and fear pouring out in gasping sobs that I couldn't control. Maxie pressed against both of us, and Vanessa said the dog could stay too, even though her lease technically didn't allow pets. Some things were more important than lease agreements. I couldn't sleep that night, just lay on Vanessa's couch staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the past few months. The sounds I'd heard, the things that had moved, the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone even when I logically knew I was. How many times had they watched me shower or change clothes? How many private moments had been violated? Vanessa sat up with me until dawn, making tea and letting me talk through my terror until my voice went hoarse. She called her boss at 6 a.m. and told him she wouldn't be coming in. Family emergency. And he didn't argue. My sister had always protected me, even when we were kids, and she was only 2 years older. Rains called at 9:30 a.m. with an update that made everything worse. The fingerprints had come back with a match in the system. One set belonged to a man named Trevor Ashford, who had a record for stalking and breaking and entering. He'd served 3 years and been released on parole 6 months ago. His last known address was a halfway house in the city, but when parole officers went to check on him, they discovered he'd stopped reporting in 5 weeks ago. No one knew where he was now. The second set of prints hadn't matched anything in the database, which meant whoever was working with Trevor had no criminal record. That person was a complete unknown. I asked Rains how Trevor could have known about my house, and she said that was the question they were trying to answer. Had he chosen my house randomly, or was there a connection I wasn't aware of? She asked me to think carefully about anyone new who'd come into my life recently, any service people or deliveries or interactions that seemed off. I went through my memories systematically, and that's when I remembered the locksmith. I'd called someone to change my locks right after the divorce, and the guy who showed up had been alone and spent almost 2 hours working on my doors. He'd asked a lot of questions about whether I lived alone, if I had a security system, what my work schedule was like. At the time, I'd thought he was just making conversation. Now every word felt sinister. I found the receipt in my email and sent the locksmith company's information to Rains. She called back within 30 minutes, sounding grim. The company was legitimate, but the locksmith I'd described didn't match any of their employees. Someone had intercepted my service call and sent their own person instead. Someone who'd taken his time installing locks he'd had keys made for in advance. Rains said this level of planning suggested Trevor Ashford wasn't working alone with just one accomplice. This might be a larger operation, possibly multiple people targeting single women in my area. She asked if I'd be willing to look at some photos to see if I could identify the fake locksmith. Rains came to Vanessa's apartment that afternoon with a laptop full of surveillance photos from my neighborhood taken over the past few weeks. Traffic cameras, security footage from neighbors' doorbell cameras, anything that might have caught the people stalking me. I scrolled through dozens of images, studying faces and body language. That's when I saw him, a man standing across the street from my house 3 days ago, partially hidden behind a tree. He was watching my front door with an expression of focused attention that made my blood run cold. I pointed him out to Rains, and she zoomed in on the image. The man was in his 30s, average height, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses that obscured most of his face. Rains ran the image through facial recognition software and came up empty. Whoever this man was, he wasn't in any law enforcement database. But when she showed the photo to other detectives in her unit, one of them recognized the jacket the man was wearing. It was standard issue from a private security company called Sentinel Protection Services. Rains made a call and discovered that Sentinel had a contract with my homeowners association to provide neighborhood security. They had access to every house's security codes and emergency contact information. They knew who lived alone and who had alarm systems and who kept spare keys hidden outside. The man in the photo was likely a Sentinel employee. This revelation changed everything. If someone at Sentinel was involved, they'd have access to dozens of potential victims' homes and personal information. Rains contacted the FBI because this had escalated from a local stalking case to something that might involve multiple victims and a criminal conspiracy. FBI agent Lawrence Kwan arrived at Vanessa's apartment that evening, bringing with him a federal case file that made my stomach turn. Sentinel Protection Services had been under investigation for 6 months following complaints from women in 4 different cities. All of them reported similar experiences: strange sounds in their homes, missing personal items, the feeling of being watched. 2 women had found evidence that someone had been living in their attics or crawl spaces. The FBI suspected Sentinel employees were using their access to target vulnerable women, but they'd lacked concrete evidence until now. Kwan asked if I'd be willing to help them build a case by allowing them to set up surveillance in my house. They wanted to catch Trevor Ashford and whoever was working with him in the act, get them on camera committing crimes that would lead to arrests and testimony that could bring down the entire operation. The request made my hands shake. The idea of going back into that house knowing someone might be hiding in the walls. But Kwan said they'd have agents stationed in every room, watching around the clock, and I'd never actually be in danger. They'd grab the suspects the moment they tried to access the crawl space. It would be over within 48 hours at most. Vanessa immediately said absolutely not, that I'd been through enough trauma already, but I surprised myself by agreeing. The thought of Trevor Ashford and his accomplices targeting other women, living in their walls and violating their privacy and safety, made me feel sick. If I could help stop them, I had to try. Kwan looked relieved and told me they'd set everything up that night. I'd go back to my house the next morning and resume my normal routine as much as possible. FBI agents would be hidden in the basement and attic and guest room, all watching the crawlspace entry points. The moment anyone tried to return, they'd be arrested. The next morning, I drove back to my house with an FBI escort. The street looked normal, neighbors leaving for work and kids waiting for school buses. My house looked the same from outside, but stepping through the front door made my chest tighten with anxiety. Agent Sofia Vega met me inside, introducing herself and 3 other agents who were already setting up surveillance equipment. Cameras had been installed throughout the house, all feeding to a command center they'd established in Mrs. Kowalski's basement next door. Vega explained that I should go about my day as normally as possible, act like nothing was different. They needed whoever was watching me to believe I was alone and vulnerable. I went to work at the accounting firm where I'd been employed for 6 years, sitting at my desk and trying to focus on spreadsheets while my mind kept drifting to the agents hiding in my house. My coworker Priya asked if I was okay, said I looked pale, and I told her I hadn't been sleeping well. It wasn't a lie. At lunch, I got a text from an unknown number. Saw you left yesterday. Everything okay? My heart rate spiked, and I immediately forwarded the message to Agent Vega. She called me within seconds, asking if I recognized the number. I didn't. Vega said they were tracing it now, and I should respond normally if I felt comfortable doing so. Keep the person engaged. I typed back. Had to stay at my sister's. Just some maintenance issues at the house. The response came within 30 seconds. What kind of issues? Need help fixing anything? The casual tone felt predatory. Like whoever was texting knew exactly what had happened and was testing to see how much I knew. I showed the exchange to Priya and watched her face go pale. She asked if I wanted her to come stay with me, and I told her everything was under control. Another lie, but one that felt necessary. Vega texted me to keep the conversation going, so I responded, just some water damage in the basement. All handled now. The unknown number replied, glad you're back home. Must be lonely there by yourself. The word lonely felt like a threat wrapped in concern. I stopped responding after that, my hands shaking too much to type. Vega called and said the number was a burner phone, untraceable, but the fact that someone was texting me suggested they were watching my house right now. They'd seen me leave yesterday and return this morning. Agent Kwan made the decision to accelerate the operation, sending a team to canvass the neighborhood looking for anyone suspicious. They found him 2 hours later. A Sentinel Protection Services van was parked 4 blocks away, positioned where the driver would have a clear view of my street. Officers approached and found the driver sitting in the front seat with binoculars and a laptop open to what looked like a live feed from inside my house. He tried to run, but they tackled him in someone's front yard, and by the time they'd secured him in handcuffs, they'd found enough evidence in the van to justify multiple felony charges. His name was Raymond Walsh, a 34-year-old Sentinel employee with access to over 200 homes in the area. His laptop contained files on 18 different women, all single, all living alone. The scope of his stalking operation was massive, but Walsh wasn't talking. He sat in the interrogation room with his arms crossed and demanded a lawyer, refusing to answer any questions about Trevor Ashford or who else was involved in the operation. Quan told me this was expected, that Walsh would likely take a plea deal in exchange for information, but it would take time. In the meantime, they needed to find Trevor before he realized his partner had been arrested. The crawl space in my house remained the best opportunity to catch him, and they wanted me to spend one more night there with agents in position. This time, Vanessa insisted on staying with me, and the agents agreed it might actually help. A house with 2 people in it might make Trevor feel more confident about his hiding spot. That night, Vanessa and I sat on my couch watching a movie neither of us was actually paying attention to. Agent Vega was in the guest room, Agent Quan in the attic, 2 more agents in the basement, all of them wearing night vision equipment and body cameras, all of them waiting for Trevor Ashford to make his move. Maxie lay at my feet, tense and alert, her ears constantly tracking sounds I couldn't hear. Around 11 p.m., Vanessa fell asleep against my shoulder, exhausted from 2 nights of keeping watch with me. I stayed awake, staring at my bedroom door and thinking about that hole in the closet wall. At 11:43 p.m., Maxie's head lifted and her ears went back. A low growl started in her throat, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I put my hand on her head and felt her whole body trembling. She was staring at the basement door. My phone buzzed with a text from Vega. Thermal imaging showing movement in crawl space. Stay on couch. Do not react. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure whoever was in my walls could hear it. Vanessa stirred beside me, starting to wake up, and I squeezed her arm to keep her quiet. Her eyes opened, and I saw her register my fear immediately. We sat frozen on the couch for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. Then we heard it. A soft scraping sound from inside the bedroom wall, like something being dragged across wood. Maxie's growl grew louder, and Vanessa's fingers dug into my arm hard enough to leave marks. My phone buzzed again. Subject attempting to access bedroom. Agents moving into position. Stay where you are. The scraping sound stopped. The house went completely silent except for Maxie's low growl and my own ragged breathing. Then my bedroom door slowly opened from the inside. Everything happened at once. Agent Vega came out of the guest room with her weapon drawn and flashlight blazing, shouting for Trevor to get on the ground. Agent Quan came down from the attic, moving fast with his gun trained on my bedroom doorway. The 2 agents in the basement came thundering up the stairs, and standing in my bedroom doorway, caught in Vega's flashlight beam, was someone I recognized immediately. My blood turned to ice as I stared at the face I'd been married to for 6 years. It wasn't Trevor Ashford. It was my ex-husband, David. David raised his hands slowly, a strange smile on his face like he'd been expecting this moment. Agent Vega ordered him to lie face down on the floor, and he complied without resistance, still smiling that unsettling smile. Quan moved forward with handcuffs while other agents cleared the bedroom to make sure no one else was hiding. Vanessa was on her feet now, shouting at David, demanding to know what he'd been doing in my house. He turned his head to look at us and said very calmly, "I never left. Not really. This is still my house." The possessive way he said "my house" made my skin crawl. They arrested David and found a second person hiding in the basement, a man who turned out to be Trevor Ashford. But the real shock came when they searched David's phone and laptop. He'd been running the entire operation. Raymond Walsh and Trevor Ashford had been working for him, paid to stalk and terrify me as revenge for the divorce. David had orchestrated everything, from the fake locksmith to the crawlspace modifications to the systematic invasion of my privacy over the past 8 months. He'd been in Seattle for work, but he'd been controlling his accomplices remotely and occasionally returning to my house to live in the walls himself. The journal they'd found wasn't Trevor's handwriting. It was David's. The FBI found evidence that David had been planning something much worse. His laptop contained detailed floor plans of my house with annotations about sound-dampening materials and ventilation systems. He'd been planning to seal me in the basement, make it look like an accident, and inherit the house we'd jointly owned. The insurance policy he'd never removed me from would have made him a wealthy man. Agent Quan said if they'd waited even a few more days to set up this operation, I might not have survived. David had been escalating, and the timeline in his notes suggested he'd been preparing to make his final move within the week. But the evidence kept getting worse. Over the next 3 days, as forensic analysts dug deeper into David's files, they uncovered a network that went far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. David hadn't just been targeting me. He'd been coordinating with Raymond Walsh for over a year, helping him identify vulnerable women and providing technical expertise for surveillance installations. Walsh's 18 victims weren't random selections. David had helped choose them based on detailed psychological profiles he'd created, looking for women who were recently divorced, isolated from family, working demanding jobs that kept them distracted. Women who wouldn't immediately recognize they were being stalked. Agent Kwan showed me a spreadsheet David had created, ranking potential victims by what he called viability scores. I was listed as number 1, but seeing the other names below mine made me physically ill. Some of these women I recognized from my divorce support group, women David had met when he'd occasionally picked me up from meetings. He'd been using my recovery process to hunt for his next targets. Kwan said they were in the process of notifying all the women on the list, offering them protective services and counseling. 3 of them had already reported finding evidence of stalking in their homes. One woman had been planning to move because she felt so unsafe, never knowing the threat was coming from inside her walls. Detective Rains arrived at Vanessa's apartment with another revelation that made my hands shake. They'd found a 4th person involved in the conspiracy, someone who'd been helping David from the beginning. David's girlfriend in Seattle, the woman he'd supposedly moved on with after our divorce, was actually his sister. They'd been estranged for years according to family records, but had reconnected specifically to plan this operation. Her name was Christine Brenner, and she'd been handling the financial side of things, paying Walsh and Ashford through untraceable cryptocurrency accounts and managing the logistics of David's trips back to my house. She'd also been the one texting me from the burner phone, testing my reactions and gathering intelligence. Rains explained that Christine had her own history of stalking, though she'd never been prosecuted. In college, she'd become obsessed with a roommate who'd rejected her romantic advances and had spent 6 months following the woman, stealing her belongings, and eventually breaking into her apartment to watch her sleep. The college had handled it internally, arranging for Christine to withdraw quietly rather than face criminal charges. That lack of consequences had apparently taught her she could get away with this behavior, and when David had reached out with his plan for revenge against me, she'd been eager to help. The FBI arrested Christine at her Seattle apartment, where they found another laptop containing detailed notes about me and the other women David was targeting. But they also found something else that shifted the entire investigation into even darker territory. Christine had been documenting everything, not just for operational purposes but for entertainment. She'd created video compilations of surveillance footage from inside my house and the houses of other victims, editing them together with music and commentary. She'd been sharing these videos on encrypted forums where other stalkers gathered to trade techniques and celebrate their violations of their victims' privacy. Agent Kwan told me this discovery had led them to 17 additional victims across 6 states, all women who'd been stalked by members of this online community. The forums had thousands of members, people sharing floor plans of their victims' homes, trading advice on how to install hidden cameras, discussing the best ways to terrorize someone without getting caught. David and Christine had been prominent members, respected for their technical expertise, and what the community called their commitment to the craft. Reading excerpts from their posts made me want to vomit. They'd turned my suffering into entertainment, my fear into content for an audience of predators. The scope of the investigation expanded daily. FBI field offices across the country began making arrests based on evidence from the forums. News coverage started calling it the largest coordinated stalking ring in American history. Victims came forward, women who'd been too afraid or too gaslit to report their experiences before. The stories were horrifyingly similar. Objects moving, sounds in walls, the feeling of being watched, missing personal items, and the constant dismissal from friends and family who thought they were being paranoid or mentally unstable. These women had been systematically terrorized by strangers who'd found community and validation in their cruelty. My own trauma got lost in the media circus for a while. Reporters camped outside Vanessa's apartment, trying to get interviews with the woman who'd helped break open the case. I refused all requests, but that didn't stop them from digging into my life. Articles appeared detailing my divorce, my work history, my social media posts from years ago. Strangers online debated whether I should have known David was dangerous, whether I bore some responsibility for not recognizing the signs earlier. The victim blaming was relentless and exhausting. Another violation on top of everything else I'd endured. Vanessa installed blackout curtains and changed her locks after someone slipped a note under her door asking for an exclusive interview and offering money. The note was polite, but the underlying threat was clear. If I didn't cooperate with their story, they'd write it anyway and I'd have no control over the narrative. My lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Judith Crane who specialized in victims' rights cases, sent cease and desist letters to 3 different media outlets for harassment. She also filed restraining orders against 2 particularly aggressive reporters who'd been following me when I left the apartment. The legal protection felt thin and insufficient, but it was something. The preliminary hearings started 4 months after David's arrest. I had to sit in a courtroom and listen to David's defense attorney argue that his client had been suffering from a psychological break caused by the trauma of divorce. They presented testimony from a psychiatrist who claimed David had developed an obsessive attachment disorder and hadn't been in full control of his actions. The argument was nonsense given the evidence of planning and coordination, but watching them try to excuse what he'd done made me rage in ways I hadn't known I was capable of. Judith squeezed my hand during the worst parts, reminding me to breathe and stay calm for the cameras. Trevor Ashford's attorney took a different approach, painting his client as a victim of David's manipulation. Ashford testified that David had promised him money and help securing permanent housing if he participated in what David had described as a psychological experiment on his ex-wife. Ashford claimed he hadn't known the full extent of the plan and had believed they were just trying to scare me into selling the house so David could buy it back at a reduced price. The testimony was clearly rehearsed and designed to minimize Ashford's culpability, but it fell apart under cross-examination when prosecutors showed text messages where Ashford had explicitly discussed the plan to eventually kill me. Raymond Walsh proved to be the prosecution's strongest witness once he'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. He described in methodical detail how David had recruited him, how they'd refined their stalking techniques through practice on other victims, how the online forum had provided both technical support and emotional validation for their activities. Walsh showed no remorse during his testimony, speaking about the women he'd terrorized with the detached clinical tone of someone discussing a hobby. When the prosecutor asked why he'd done it, Walsh shrugged and said it gave him a sense of power he couldn't find anywhere else in his life. The honesty was chilling. Christine Brenner refused to cooperate with prosecutors or testify against her brother. She sat through her own hearings with a defiant expression, occasionally smiling at David across the courtroom in a way that suggested they were sharing a private joke. Her attorney argued that Christine had been under David's psychological control, that their relationship had been abusive, and she'd been coerced into participating. But prosecutors had chat logs showing Christine had been enthusiastic about every aspect of the plan, often suggesting escalations that even David had considered too risky. She'd been a willing and eager participant, not a victim of her brother's manipulation. The trial took 8 months from start to finish. I testified for 2 full days, describing the timeline of strange occurrences in my house, the discovery of the crawl space, the moment I'd seen David in my doorway. David's attorney tried to rattle me during cross-examination, asking intrusive questions about our marriage and whether I'd done anything to provoke his behavior. Judith objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained most of her objections, but the questions still landed and left marks. I left the witness stand feeling scraped raw and exposed, every private moment of my life now part of public record. Vanessa testified about the night of David's arrest, describing my fear and Maxie's behavior, and the horror of realizing my ex-husband had been living in my walls. She broke down crying on the stand when the prosecutor asked how this had affected her perception of safety in her own home, admitting she now checked her closets and crawl spaces multiple times a night and had installed motion sensors throughout her apartment. The judge called a recess to let her compose herself, and I watched David's attorney make notes about using her emotional testimony to argue that the prosecution was being overly dramatic about the severity of the crimes. The other victims testified throughout the trial, a parade of women describing similar experiences of violation and terror. Their testimony established the pattern prosecutors needed to prove this wasn't an isolated incident, but a coordinated criminal enterprise. One woman described finding a camera hidden in her bedroom smoke detector and the months of footage that had been collected before she'd discovered it. Another talked about the psychological breakdown she'd suffered after finding evidence someone had been in her house repeatedly, how she'd been hospitalized for anxiety and paranoid ideation until the FBI investigation had validated her experiences. Each story added weight to the prosecution's case, while simultaneously crushing me with the knowledge of how many people had been hurt. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding David guilty on all counts. Raymond Walsh got 15 years, Trevor Ashford got 12, Christine Brenner got 18, her sentence enhanced because of her role in distributing the surveillance videos and recruiting new members to the stalking forum. The judge's statement during sentencing was scathing, calling their crimes a violation of the most fundamental human right to safety in one's own home. She said she was recommending against any possibility of early parole and would be writing letters to the parole board to ensure they understood the severity and premeditated nature of these offenses. David stared at me throughout his sentencing hearing, his expression blank, but his eyes full of something I couldn't quite identify. Hatred, maybe, or satisfaction at knowing he'd caused lasting damage even though he'd been caught. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, David stood and spoke directly to me, ignoring the judge's instruction to address the court. He said he'd loved me once, but I'd destroyed that love through my selfishness and refusal to work on our marriage. He said everything that had happened was a natural consequence of my choices, that I'd driven him to this. The judge cut him off and added contempt of court to his charges, but his words still landed and left bruises. His sentence came down at 35 years with no possibility of parole before serving at least 25. It felt simultaneously too long and not long enough. I sold the house 3 months after the trial ended. Couldn't imagine ever sleeping there again. Couldn't walk through those rooms without seeing David's face in my bedroom doorway or imagining him watching me from inside the walls. Vanessa helped me pack, and we found more evidence of his presence I'd missed. Scratches on the back of photo frames where he'd removed pictures to study them, small notations in the margins of my books, rearranged items in kitchen drawers that I'd chalked up to my own forgetfulness. He'd been touching everything, inserting himself into every aspect of my life even after I'd thought I was free of him. The house sold quickly despite its history, bought by a developer who planned to gut renovate it and flip it for profit. I felt a twinge of guilt about not disclosing everything to potential buyers, but my lawyer assured me that the criminal case was public record and anyone doing basic due diligence would find the information. The new owner did find out, called me furious about property value impacts, but there was nothing legally he could do. I'd disclosed everything required by law. The rest was available through court records he should have checked before closing. I donated half the proceeds from the sale to organizations supporting stalking victims and used the rest to start over somewhere new. I moved across the country to Denver, where Vanessa had gotten a job offer she'd been considering. We rented a second-floor apartment with good security and no basement, no attic, no crawl spaces where anyone could hide. Maxie adapted better than I did, happy as long as we were together. I started therapy twice a week and joined a support group for stalking victims. The group was small, just 6 of us meeting in a community center conference room, but the understanding was immediate and profound. These were people who knew what it felt like to have your home violated, to question your own perceptions, to be told you were overreacting when your instincts were screaming danger. One woman in the group, Lydia, had been stalked by her landlord, who'd been entering her apartment when she was at work and rearranging small items to make her think she was losing her mind. Another, Karen, had discovered her neighbor had drilled holes through their shared wall and had been watching her for 3 years. Their stories were different from mine in details, but identical in the core violation: the theft of safety and privacy, the permanent scar left by knowing someone had consumed your life without permission. We traded coping strategies and validated each other's ongoing struggles, and slowly I began to believe I might eventually heal enough to function normally again. The nightmares came frequently at first. Vivid dreams where I'd wake up in my old house and realize someone was in the walls again. I'd try to run, but the doors would be locked and the windows painted shut, and I'd hear David's voice coming from every direction at once, telling me I'd never truly escape him. Maxie learned to wake me from these nightmares by jumping on the bed and licking my face, her solid, warm presence reminding me I was in Denver, in a safe apartment, with my sister sleeping in the next room. The nightmares gradually decreased in frequency, but never fully stopped. I changed careers, unable to return to accounting after everything that had happened. The focus and concentration required for financial work had been damaged by the trauma, and I found myself making careless errors that I never would have made before. My former boss, a kind man named Leonard who'd given me paid leave during the trial, understood when I submitted my resignation. He wrote me a reference letter that focused on my years of excellent work rather than my recent struggles, and I appreciated the grace in that gesture. I enrolled in a certificate program for victim advocacy, thinking maybe I could transform my experience into something that might help others. The advocacy training was harder than I'd expected, not academically but emotionally. Every case study triggered memories of my own experience. Every discussion of victim psychology forced me to confront aspects of my trauma I'd been avoiding. My instructor, a survivor herself, took me aside after I'd broken down during a particularly difficult discussion about victim blaming. She said this work wasn't for everyone and there was no shame in choosing a different path. But she also said survivors who did this work often brought an authenticity and understanding that no amount of academic training could replicate. I decided to push through, and slowly the case studies stopped feeling like personal attacks and started feeling like puzzles I could help solve. 6 months into my advocacy training, I got a call from Agent Kwan. The FBI had continued investigating the stalking forums and had identified over 200 active participants across 30 states. They were building cases against the most egregious offenders, people who'd documented hundreds of victims and had been stalking for years. Kwan wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify at some of these trials, to put a face and voice to the impact these crimes had on real people. The request made my stomach churn, the thought of sitting in more courtrooms and reliving my trauma for more juries. But I thought about those 200 active stalkers and the thousands of women who might be targets, and I agreed. The next 2 years became a blur of courtrooms and victim impact statements. I testified at 11 different trials across 6 states, describing my experience and the lasting psychological damage it had caused. Defense attorneys tried various tactics to discredit me, suggesting I was seeking attention or exaggerating for sympathy or had economic motivations for participating in these trials. Judith traveled with me to most of them, objecting when appropriate and preparing me for the attacks before they came. Each trial was its own trauma, but each conviction felt like a small piece of justice, not just for me, but for all the women who'd been targeted by these predators. Between trials, I completed my advocacy certification and started volunteering at a local crisis center. My role was to work with stalking victims, helping them navigate the reporting process and connect with resources. The first woman I counseled was named Diana, and she'd been experiencing the same symptoms I'd had: objects moving, sounds in her walls, the overwhelming feeling of being watched. When she described it, I could see my own fear reflected in her eyes. I helped her file a police report that was actually taken seriously, connected her with a security company that did a thorough sweep of her home, and stayed with her when they found evidence someone had been entering through her attic. Having been through it myself gave me credibility that professional training alone couldn't provide. Maxie became certified as a therapy dog, her natural sensitivity to human emotions making her perfect for the work. We'd visit the crisis center together, and I watched traumatized women relax slightly when Maxie pressed against their legs or rested her head in their laps. The dog who'd saved my life was now helping save others. Her ability to sense danger translated into an ability to provide comfort. She was getting older now, gray around her muzzle and moving a bit slower, but her awareness never diminished. She still checked every room when we entered a new space, still positioned herself between me and doorways, still alerted to threats I couldn't perceive. 3 years after David's conviction, I received my first letter from him in prison. It came to the crisis center where I worked, which meant he'd somehow found out where I was despite the protections I'd put in place. The envelope sat on my desk for 2 days before I could bring myself to open it. Inside was 3 pages of David's precise handwriting, and the contents made my hands shake so badly I dropped the letter. He'd written about his daily routine in prison, the classes he was taking, the therapy he was attending. Then, in the final paragraph, he told me he'd been studying the appeals process and believed he had grounds to challenge his conviction. He said he'd be filing paperwork soon, and I should prepare for us to see each other again in court. I called Judith immediately, and she requested an emergency motion to prevent David from contacting me further. The judge granted it, adding penalties if David violated the no-contact order. But the damage was done. David had found a way to reach me, to remind me he was still thinking about me, still exerting whatever power he could from behind bars. His appeal was eventually denied, but the process took 8 months and forced me to review evidence and testimony I'd been trying to move past. The legal system that had convicted him now gave him tools to extend his control, and there was nothing I could do but endure it. Christine filed her own appeal based on claims of inadequate counsel, arguing her attorney hadn't properly investigated evidence of David's psychological manipulation of her. The appeal gained some traction initially, with an appellate judge agreeing to review certain aspects of her case. I had to testify again, this time about Christine's behavior during the original investigation and trial, providing evidence that she'd been a willing participant rather than a coerced accomplice. The appellate process dragged on for over a year before her conviction was ultimately upheld, but those months of uncertainty reopened wounds I'd thought were beginning to scar over. The stalking forum that David and Christine had participated in was shut down by federal authorities, but new ones emerged almost immediately. Agent Kwan kept me updated on the FBI's ongoing efforts to infiltrate these communities and identify potential victims before crimes occurred. He said the internet had made it easier for predators to find each other and share techniques, creating echo chambers where behavior that should be recognized as criminal got normalized and celebrated. The FBI was working with tech companies to identify and report these forums, but it was a game of whack-a-mole with new sites appearing as fast as old ones got shut down. I started speaking at law enforcement conferences about my experience, helping train officers to recognize signs of stalking that victims themselves might dismiss or rationalize. Many cops still treated stalking as a minor nuisance rather than the serious crime it was, and I'd hear stories of women being told to just get a restraining order or install better locks, advice that was useless when the stalker had already gained access to their homes. My presentations included photos of the crawl space where David had lived, the journal where he documented my routines, the surveillance footage he and Christine had compiled. The visual evidence was undeniable, and usually convinced even the most skeptical officers that this was a crime that required serious investigation. One conference brought me face-to-face with Detective Rains, who'd been the first to take my case seriously. She told me that my case had changed how her department approached stalking complaints, that they now automatically brought in K-9 units to check for hidden spaces when victims reported feelings of being watched. She said they'd found 3 more cases of people living in walls or attics in homes in my old neighborhood alone, all of them caught because officers knew what to look for after seeing what had happened to me. The knowledge that my nightmare had led to others being rescued earlier made some of the suffering feel purposeful, though I still would have chosen to avoid it all if given the option. Vanessa met someone through her work, a kind man named Philip who worked in nonprofit management, and had the patient understanding of someone who'd survived his own trauma. I watched their relationship develop with cautious optimism, happy for my sister but hyper-aware of warning signs that might indicate Philip wasn't what he seemed. I ran a background check on him without telling Vanessa, unable to stop myself from trying to protect her. The check came back clean, but I still insisted on being present for their first several dates, watching his body language and listening to how he spoke to her. Vanessa tolerated my overprotectiveness with grace, understanding it came from a place of love and fear rather than judgment. When Philip proposed to Vanessa after a year of dating, she asked me to be her maid of honor, and I cried with a complicated mix of happiness and grief. I was genuinely thrilled for her, but the reminder of my own failed marriage and the horror it had become made it hard to celebrate without reservation. The wedding was small and intimate, held in a garden with just close family and friends. I gave a toast that focused entirely on Vanessa's strength and resilience, how she'd supported me through the darkest period of my life while building her own career and relationship. I didn't mention David by name, but everyone present knew what I was talking about when I said my sister had taught me that family meant choosing to protect each other, even when it was hard. 4 years after David's conviction, I met someone myself. His name was Julian, and he was a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. We met at a victim advocacy conference where we were both presenting, and we spent 3 hours after our sessions talking about the intersection of legal justice and psychological healing. He asked me to dinner, and I said yes, then immediately second-guessed the decision. The thought of dating again, of letting someone into my life who might turn out to be another David, made me want to cancel. But Vanessa encouraged me to at least meet him in public, and I went to the restaurant with Maxie as my emotional support animal and Vanessa waiting in her car in the parking lot as backup. Julian was patient with my obvious anxiety, asking permission before moving closer or touching my hand, reading my body language and adjusting his behavior accordingly. We talked for 4 hours about everything except my case, though he clearly knew who I was and what had happened. On our third date, I told him I'd run a background check on him and installed a tracking app on my phone that Vanessa was monitoring. Instead of being offended, he said those precautions were completely reasonable given my history and offered to provide additional references if it would make me feel safer. That response, more than anything else, made me think maybe I could trust him. Our relationship developed slowly over the next year. Julian never pushed for more than I was comfortable giving, respecting my need to maintain control and predictability. He met me at my apartment rather than expecting me to come to his place where I didn't know the layout or escape routes. He introduced me to his friends and family early, giving me opportunity to verify his identity and history through multiple sources. When I finally felt ready to be intimate with him, we established explicit boundaries and safe words, treating it with the seriousness that someone with my trauma history needed. His understanding never felt performative or condescending, just genuine recognition that my experiences had changed how I moved through the world. Maxie approved of Julian, which mattered more than I wanted to admit. She'd been wary of every new person I'd met since David's arrest, positioning herself between me and strangers with clear protective intent. But with Julian, she'd relaxed after just a few meetings, allowing him to pet her and eventually lying down when he was present rather than maintaining vigilant watch. I trusted my dog's instincts more than my own, and her acceptance of Julian helped me lower my guard incrementally. 5 years after the trial, I was asked to consult on a documentary about the stalking forum cases. The filmmakers wanted to interview me and several other victims, creating a comprehensive look at how the forums operated and the devastating impact they'd had on targets. I initially refused, not wanting to relive everything on camera for public consumption, but the director, a woman named Isabel who'd done powerful work on other justice issues, convinced me that the documentary could serve as education and warning, potentially preventing others from becoming victims. I agreed to participate with strict conditions about how my story would be presented and what details would be included. The filming process was grueling. 10 hours of interviews where I walked through every aspect of my experience. Isabel asked difficult questions about moments I'd tried to forget, pushing me to articulate the psychological impact in ways I'd avoided even in therapy. But she also gave me control over the final product, letting me review cuts and request changes when something felt too invasive or didn't accurately represent my experience. The documentary premiered at a film festival and won awards for its unflinching look at a crime that often remained invisible. Watching it with Julian and Vanessa in the audience, seeing my story contextualized alongside other victims and expert analysis, I felt both exposed and validated. The documentary led to increased media attention that I still wasn't comfortable with. Reporters requested interviews, and my story was featured in podcasts and news articles. Some of the coverage was respectful and informative, focusing on the need for better stalking laws and resources for victims. But other coverage sensationalized the details, treating my trauma as entertainment and speculating about aspects of my marriage that had no bearing on David's crimes. I learned to decline most interview requests, protecting my privacy while still trying to contribute to public understanding of stalking as a serious crime. David sent another letter after the documentary aired, this one shorter but somehow more menacing. He wrote that he'd watched the documentary during a screening at the prison and thought I'd misrepresented certain aspects of our relationship. He said the truth was more complicated than I'd made it seem, and someday people would understand his side of the story. The implication that he still felt entitled to control the narrative, that he believed there was a version of events where his actions were justified, made me furious in a way his previous letters hadn't. This wasn't remorse or even manipulation. This was genuine belief that he'd been wronged. I showed the letter to my current therapist, a trauma specialist named Dr. Okafor, who'd been helping me process the lingering effects of everything that had happened. She pointed out that the letter revealed something important. David would never accept responsibility for his choices, never recognize the harm he'd caused, never become the person I'd once hoped he could be. She said accepting that truth was part of healing, letting go of any fantasy that he'd eventually understand and apologize. The David who'd emerged during the investigation and trial was the real David, and the kind man I'd married had been a carefully constructed facade. Accepting that dichotomy was painful but necessary. 6 years after the trial, I received notification that Trevor Ashford was up for parole. Despite his sentence, he'd apparently been a model prisoner and had completed various rehabilitation programs that made him eligible for early release consideration. I was allowed to submit a victim impact statement to the parole board, and I spent weeks crafting a letter that detailed the ongoing effects of his crimes without becoming so emotional that it could be dismissed as vindictive. The parole hearing was held via video conference, and I watched Ashford present himself as a reformed man who'd made terrible mistakes, but had used his time in prison to become better. The parole board asked Ashford direct questions about his crimes, and he gave carefully practiced answers that acknowledged wrongdoing while minimizing his own agency. He claimed he'd been manipulated by David, that he'd been struggling with addiction at the time, that he'd had limited understanding of how his actions would affect me. The responses were designed to present him as more victim than perpetrator, and I could see some board members responding sympathetically. When it was my turn to speak, I looked directly into the camera and described the nightmares I still had, the hypervigilance that colored every aspect of my life, the destroyed sense of safety that Ashford had helped create. I said his claims of manipulation rang hollow, given the text messages where he'd enthusiastically participated in planning my eventual murder. The parole board denied Ashford's release, and I felt a rush of relief followed immediately by anxiety about the next hearing in 2 years. This wasn't over. Every few years for potentially decades, I'd have to relive this trauma, arguing against the release of people who'd terrorized me. The justice system had convicted them, but now it required me to continuously justify keeping them imprisoned. The burden fell on victims to maintain accountability, and the weight of that responsibility felt crushing. Julian proposed to me 7 years after we'd started dating, on a quiet evening at home with just Maxie as witness. He didn't make a big production of it, just told me he loved me and wanted to build a life together and understood if I needed time to think about it. I said yes immediately, surprising both of us, and then burst into tears because I'd never thought I'd trust someone enough to marry again. He held me while I cried and told me we'd move at whatever pace I needed, that marriage could look however we wanted it to look. We set a wedding date 2 years out, giving me time to feel secure in the decision and plan something that felt right rather than obligated. The wedding was even smaller than Vanessa's had been, just immediate family and a few close friends at a courthouse followed by dinner at our favorite restaurant. I wore a simple dress instead of a wedding gown, and we wrote our own vows that focused on choosing each other daily rather than promises of forever. Maxie was there, wearing a flower collar and sitting between Julian and me during the brief ceremony. The officiant kept it short and focused, understanding without being told that I needed this to feel nothing like my first wedding. Afterward, Vanessa hugged me tight and whispered that she was proud of me for letting myself be happy again. Maxie died peacefully in her sleep 8 years after she'd first alerted me to danger in my house. She was 14 years old, which was good for a dog her size, and she'd been slowing down gradually over the past year. Julian and I found her in her bed beside our bedroom door, her face peaceful and her body finally free of the vigilance she'd maintained for so long. I broke down completely, sobbing in a way I hadn't since the immediate aftermath of David's arrest. Maxie had been more than a pet. She'd been my protector, my therapist, my early warning system. She'd saved my life and then helped me rebuild it, and losing her felt like losing a piece of myself. We buried Maxie in the backyard of the small house Julian and I had bought, planting a tree over her grave that would grow as a living memorial. I couldn't bring myself to get another dog immediately, the grief too raw, and the fear that no other dog could ever measure up to Maxie. But 6 months later, Julian surprised me with a visit to a shelter where a 2-year-old German Shepherd mix named Apollo was available for adoption. The dog had been surrendered by a family who couldn't handle his intense anxiety and protectiveness, traits that would make him difficult for most adopters, but might be exactly what I needed. Apollo came home with us that day, and within a week he'd established the same protective patterns Maxie had maintained. He checked rooms before I entered them, positioned himself between me and doorways, alerted to sounds I couldn't hear. Where Maxie's protection had felt maternal and gentle, Apollo's was more aggressive and obvious, his instinct to defend rather than just warn. I worked with a professional trainer to channel those instincts appropriately, teaching Apollo when his protection was needed and when he could relax. The process helped both of us, giving me back some of the security I'd lost when Maxie died. 9 years after David's conviction, I published a memoir about my experience. The writing process had taken 3 years and had been therapeutically brutal, forcing me to organize chaotic memories into coherent narrative. My editor pushed me to go deeper into the psychological impact, to articulate not just what happened, but how it changed me. The resulting book was raw and uncomfortable, detailing things I'd never spoken about publicly. The shame of being victimized by someone I'd loved, the guilt of not recognizing the danger sooner, the rage at systems that had failed to protect me. The memoir became a bestseller almost immediately, resonating with readers who'd experienced similar violations or who were learning for the first time how common stalking was. I did a limited book tour, speaking at bookstores and universities about the need for better stalking laws and more resources for victims. At every event, women approached me afterward to share their own stories, whispering about sounds in their walls or exes who wouldn't let go, or feelings of being watched that everyone told them were paranoia. I collected their stories and passed information to advocacy organizations that could provide help, becoming an informal clearinghouse for victims who didn't know where else to turn. David filed a lawsuit from prison attempting to block publication of the memoir, claiming it violated his privacy and portrayed him in a false light. The lawsuit was frivolous and quickly dismissed, but it achieved his real goal of reminding me he was still watching and still trying to exert control. His lawyer sent a letter threatening additional legal action if I continued speaking publicly about the case, and Judith responded with a letter explaining all the ways David's threats constituted harassment and could result in additional charges. The exchange was exhausting, another reminder that being David's victim was a permanent condition, rather than something that ended with his conviction. Christine was released from prison after serving 14 years of her 18-year sentence, her time reduced for good behavior and completion of rehabilitation programs. I received notification of her release date and location per victim protection laws, and the knowledge that she was free made me hypervigilant in ways I'd thought I'd moved past. She was required to register as a sex offender and prohibited from using computers or social media, but those restrictions felt inadequate given what she'd done. Julian and I discussed moving to a different city where Christine wouldn't know to find us, but I refused to let her drive me from the home we'd built. We installed additional security measures instead, cameras and alarms and reinforced locks that made our house feel like a fortress. 3 months after Christine's release, I received a package at my publisher's office. Inside was a copy of my memoir with every page marked up in Christine's handwriting, annotations that ranged from corrections of minor details to lengthy diatribes about my supposed distortions of the truth. The package violated her release conditions in multiple ways, and she was arrested within hours of the publisher notifying authorities. She was sent back to prison to serve the remainder of her original sentence, and I felt a grim satisfaction that she'd been unable to restrain herself, even when freedom was contingent on leaving me alone. 10 years after David's conviction, I was invited to testify before Congress about the need for federal stalking legislation. Existing laws were patchwork and inconsistent, with some states treating stalking as a minor misdemeanor and others as a serious felony. The federal government had limited jurisdiction except in cases involving interstate activity or electronic surveillance. I joined other victims and law enforcement officials in presenting testimony about the gaps in current law and the need for comprehensive reform. The hearing was covered by major media outlets, and several Congresspeople expressed genuine interest in drafting new legislation. The Federal Anti-Stalking Act that eventually passed included provisions I'd specifically advocated for: mandatory training for law enforcement on recognizing stalking patterns, funding for victim services, enhanced penalties for stalkers who used technology or violated protective orders, and creation of a national stalking registry similar to sex offender registries. David and Christine were among the first entries in the registry when it launched, their names and photos searchable by anyone who wanted to verify whether someone they knew had a stalking conviction. The law wasn't perfect, but it represented meaningful progress, and knowing I'd contributed to that change made some of the suffering feel less meaningless. Raymond Walsh died in prison 5 years into his sentence, killed during a fight with another inmate who'd learned about his crimes and decided to serve his own form of justice. I felt nothing when I received the notification, no satisfaction or grief, just a numb acknowledgement that one of the people who'd terrorized me would never be released. Agent Kwan told me that prison was particularly dangerous for offenders whose crimes involved stalking women, that inmates considered those crimes especially contemptible and often meted out brutal punishment. I didn't celebrate Walsh's death, but I didn't mourn it either. 11 years after the trial, Julian and I had a daughter we named Iris. The pregnancy had terrified me, the vulnerability of carrying new life while still feeling vulnerable myself. But Julian had been steadfast in his support, attending every appointment and taking on extra responsibilities so I could focus on therapy and managing anxiety. Iris was born healthy and alert, her eyes focusing on me with such intensity that I immediately thought of Maxie. Becoming a mother changed something fundamental in me, shifting my focus from my own trauma to protecting this tiny human from ever experiencing what I'd been through. Iris grew up in a house with visible security measures, and a mother who couldn't hide her hypervigilance no matter how hard she tried. I checked on her constantly through the night, unable to trust that she was safe even with monitors and alarms and Apollo sleeping beside her crib. Julian gently suggested I was being overprotective, and my therapist Dr. Okafor helped me work on strategies for managing my anxiety without transferring it to my daughter. Slowly I learned to let Iris exist without my constant surveillance, to trust that the protections we'd built were sufficient, to believe that my trauma didn't have to become hers. David requested to be added to Iris's birth certificate, claiming he had rights as my ex-husband, even though he'd been convicted of trying to kill me and had been imprisoned years before her conception. The request was legally absurd but psychologically devastating. Another reminder that he still thought he owned me in some fundamental way. Judith handled it with a brief letter explaining all the reasons the request would never be granted, and I tried not to think about David sitting in his cell, imagining himself part of my new family. 12 years after David's conviction, I accepted a position as director of a national victim advocacy organization. The role would involve policy work and public speaking and coordinating services for victims across the country. It felt like culmination of everything I'd been working toward, transforming my personal nightmare into systemic change. My first initiative as director was launching a hotline specifically for stalking victims, staffed by people who'd survived similar experiences and could provide both practical advice and emotional validation. The hotline received over 10,000 calls in its first year, revealing how desperate victims were for someone who would believe them and take their experiences seriously. Iris started kindergarten, and I had to fight my instinct to keep her home where I could watch her constantly. I met with her teacher and principal to discuss safety protocols, probably coming across as the paranoid parent I'd tried not to become. But the school was understanding, implementing check-in procedures and being vigilant about who had access to the building. I taught Iris about stranger danger and what to do if someone made her feel uncomfortable, age-appropriate lessons that I hoped would empower rather than frighten her. Watching her walk into school that first day, so small and vulnerable, made my chest ache with the desire to shield her from every possible harm. 15 years after David's arrest, on a random afternoon while I was working from home, I received a call from a prison chaplain. David had died of a heart attack that morning, collapsing during his shift in the prison laundry. The chaplain said David had requested that I be notified directly and had left a letter to be delivered upon his death. I told the chaplain to destroy the letter without reading it, that I wanted nothing from David alive or dead. After I hung up, I sat in my office shaking, feeling a complicated rush of relief and grief and guilt that I couldn't fully process. David was gone. The threat was finally, permanently over. I didn't attend David's funeral, didn't send flowers or condolences to his family who'd never acknowledged what he'd done to me. Christine was still in prison and wasn't granted leave to attend. According to later reports, only 3 people showed up to his burial: his mother, a brother I'd never met, and his prison chaplain. The small attendance felt like justice in its own way, proof that David's actions had destroyed not just his victims, but his own life and relationships. I mourned not David himself, but the man I'd thought he was, the person I'd loved who'd never actually existed. The letter David had left was delivered despite my instructions, forwarded by his lawyer who claimed he had a legal obligation to do so. I let it sit unopened on my desk for 3 weeks before Julian finally suggested I either read it or burn it, but stop giving it power by leaving it in limbo. I chose to burn it, taking it outside to our fire pit and watching the envelope catch and curl into ash. Whatever David's final words to me were, they didn't matter anymore. He'd taken enough of my life. I wasn't giving him my future, too. Apollo died at age 13, his death peaceful like Maxie's had been before him. We buried him next to Maxie under their shared tree, and Iris helped plant flowers around the graves. She'd been 6 when we'd gotten Apollo and barely remembered a time without him. His death hit her hard, her first real experience with loss. I held her while she cried and told her about Maxie and how both dogs had been protectors who'd given us the gift of feeling safe. We adopted a new dog, a female Belgian Malinois named Luna, who'd been trained as a police canine but had been retired early due to an injury. Luna was intense and focused, treating home security as her personal mission. Iris grew up knowing the general outline of my story, age-appropriate details about the scary thing that had happened before she was born, and why Mom was sometimes extra careful about locks and strangers. As she got older, I shared more, wanting her to understand without traumatizing her with details she wasn't ready for. When she was 12, she asked to read my memoir, and Julian and I discussed whether she was ready for the full truth. We decided to let her read it, staying available to answer questions and process difficult sections. She came to me afterward with tears in her eyes and hugged me tight, telling me I was the bravest person she knew. Christine died in prison at age 62, her death officially ruled as suicide by hanging. I received notification and felt nothing but a weary relief that both of the people who'd orchestrated my stalking were now gone. Their deaths didn't erase what they'd done, didn't heal the trauma they'd caused, but they removed the possibility of future contact or threats. The final loose end was tied off, and I could move forward knowing they were permanently in my past. Now, 20 years after Maxie first barked at that basement door, I'm 54 years old with gray in my hair and permanent lines around my eyes from years of hypervigilance. Iris is in college studying criminal justice, inspired by my story to pursue work helping victims. Julian is still patient and understanding, having spent 2 decades proving that not all men are threats. Luna is 7 now, still protective but mellower than she was in her early years. I continue my advocacy work, speaking at conferences and consulting on cases and fighting for better laws and resources. The nightmares come less frequently now, maybe once every few months instead of weekly. I can sleep through the night sometimes without checking locks or peering into shadows. The scars are permanent. I'll never trust empty spaces or locked doors or the feeling of being alone in a house. I'll always check crawl spaces and attics and anywhere someone could hide. I'll always listen for footsteps that shouldn't be there and sounds that don't have obvious sources. But I've built a life anyway, carved out safety through vigilance and security measures, and the love of people who've proven trustworthy through decades of consistency. Survival isn't about forgetting what happened or moving past trauma. It's about carrying the weight while still finding moments of joy and purpose. It's about recognizing that Maxie's midnight barking saved my life and choosing to honor that gift by living as fully as my damaged nervous system allows. It's about accepting that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again, but you can still decide who and what you allow through the threshold. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.